Thank you for listening. All of you in Cyberland, please excuse my attire. My heater isn't working, and I am cold. Kind of heavy subject today. Anybody that was around in 2010 and 2011 will probably remember old Charlie Sheen. 2010, Charlie Sheen was the man to be. He had nice clothes. He had all the acting jobs in the world. He was very wealthy. He had the nice cars, everything. But in 2011, no one wanted to be Charlie Sheen. Instead of being a famous TV actor, Charlie Sheen became the face of substance abuse disorder, or more commonly known as drug addiction. He went on TV and made crazy claims like he was from Mars. He had tiger blood. Before long, he had lost his acting jobs, he'd lost his cars, he'd lost his nice clothes, and he'd lost most of his money. Today, thankfully, Charlie Sheen is in recovery. In a 2019 interview with the British talk show Loose Women, Charlie Sheen had this to say about his rock bottom. Quote, "To this day, I'm not sure how I created all that chaos. It's as if some alien or demonic possession took over. It didn't feel like me, not like how I am existing today," unquote. According to statistics compiled from drugabuse.gov and the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, over 200,000 people die every year from substance abuse-related causes. As you can imagine from this statistic, substance abuse is a very real issue, especially in America. However, there are still people that doubt that drug addiction truly represents a disease. On the contrary, drug addiction, known as substance abuse disorder, is listed as a diagnosable mental disorder in the DSM-V, which is the official guideline and source for mental disorders. I believe addiction is a disease due to it being a combination of three malfunctions of the brain. The first is that it has a genetic component. The second is that it has a chemical dependency component. And the third being that it involves a complex and very rigid web of associations and new patterns of living that make it very hard for a person to return to normal functioning. I myself am a psychology major. I've worked with people with drug abuse issues for 6 years. A lot of this is based on observation, and others is based on very good research. So there's a genetic predisposition to addiction. Who can become an addict? Anyone can become an addict. However, according to an article from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, there are specific genes that have been linked to substance abuse disorder, and I'll spare you the very long, complicated names of those genes. In addition, research recently has proved an epigenetic link to substance abuse disorder. Epigenetics, of course, are the idea that a gene can lie dormant in a person, and certain things in a person's environment, stress, etc., will set it off. Temperament and personality also have something to do with developing substance abuse disorder. In fact, temperament can influence what drugs a person chooses to use. Temperament and personality, anyone that has done a little bit of psychological research will know, also have a basis in genetics. Once you have this genetic predisposition, or even if you don't, most mind-altering substances or psychoactive substances have the potential to create a chemical dependency in the brain. Each drug works differently, but essentially a chemical dependency is the brain saying, "I can't work without this." And opioids, they flood the brain with artificial opium. The brain produces opium on its own. When it's flooded with artificial opium, it'll stop making that opium. So withdrawals from opioids are very painful, can result in what's called kicking, which is the lashing out of your body due to neurological imbalances and from sheer pain from not having opium in your system. Opioid withdrawals can also be deadly. Psychostimulants cause the brain to overproduce neurotransmitters such as dopamine. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers of the brain. People, for example, that are withdrawing from meth have a hard time feeling pleasure or joy or satisfaction, and sometimes that can be lifelong. Alcohol, likewise, depresses in its use certain areas of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is where your personality is. When a person stops using alcohol, the brain's not depressed, doesn't really know what to do with itself. It can have seizures, it can result in marked personality changes, and it also can be deadly to withdraw from alcohol. So, these dependencies can cause a person to crave and seek out a drug, both consciously and subconsciously, and as we all know, subconscious urges, they're hard to resist. Finally, associations make it very hard to break out of the cycle of drug addiction. Associations are the ties that your brain puts between unrelated stimuli as part of learning. Usually when a person begins or falls into drug addiction, they will lose jobs, they'll lose relationships, and they'll have a much lower standard of living. These cause a person to learn new ways of functioning. These new ways of functioning are rewarded by the drug and by a continuance of survival. So the person becomes stuck, essentially, in those new behaviors. In addition to this, dualdiagnosis.org says that of the 17.5 million Americans living with a serious mental illness, 4 million of those also suffer from substance abuse disorder. Essentially, a person copes with their mental illness, with the symptoms of it, with the drugs. They are rewarded with temporary relief from the symptoms. That can make it very hard for a person to convince their brain that the terrible consequences of drug use are actually bad for them. The brain's going to keep looking for it because it thinks it's good for it, even if that drug is killing you. The daily reinforcement of these associations from living in the environment of addiction makes it very difficult for an individual to unlearn addictive behavior and return to normal, healthy functioning. So as you can see, it's a triad problem. If you're listening to this presentation and thinking, the brain is essentially attacking itself and the situation seems hopeless, you may be right. According to drugabuse.gov and statnews.com, only 10% of addicts that enter into recovery or treatment maintain it. However, this hopelessness that an addict feels may be a good thing. In an interview in 2019 with Graham Bassinger, Steve-O, another very famous substance abuser and star of Jackass, had this to say about his entrance into recovery. If part of you thinks, oh, there's hope for me and I can manage it, you aren't a candidate for recovery. Recovery starts with an admission of complete defeat. We admit that we got our butt kicked and we surrender. The recognition of addiction as a disease can help reduce the stigma of those suffering from that disease, and furthermore, it can encourage people to seek the professional help they desperately need. In addition, it can push scientists to research more successful treatment methods and maybe help reduce those terrifying numbers that we discussed earlier. 200,000 people a year, just in America, to far less. There is hope, but we've got to be objective about it. Thank you for listening.